before we get started, a couple announcements to pass your way. First of all, how's everyone doing? Okay. Expect you guys to be nice today, okay? Dwayne? Yeah. Behave, best behavior. Craig, keep on the line. Yeah, I don't know. You got Craig, Dwayne, and you got Wally back there. Yeah. I told Wally through the line today, the sermon is on shrewdness. I said, we don't confuse shrewdness with becoming an old curmudgeon, right? But I'm aspiring to do that. I'm still more so. He said it takes a lot of time to develop that gift. Well, it's good to see everyone. We are privileged today to have Reverend Tom Phillips from Illinois. So he's up visiting Josh, him and his wife are up visiting Josh and Emily. And so then I was contacted, mentioned that he was coming through this way, and he said, would you be open for me sharing with your church about the ministry to the deaf? And I jumped at it, and as I mentioned to you before, with Hired Things, the youth organization that we work with, we did a Hired Things conferences and church services. They would have interpreters there, and it was very, very, very fascinating to see and to hear about. And so we're going to have him share for the next 45 minutes here a little bit about what he does in the ministry, particular ministry of communicating the gospel through sight, and he'll talk more about that. And then at the 10:30 service, we'll have the privilege of having them sign the service. And so we'll be signing the whole service with us at the 10:30 service here. So anyway, without further ado, but real quick, any other announcements I need to mention at all to pass on? I always like to make sure to give opportunity. Any announcements to keep us informed. I mentioned this morning. I'll mention again. I'll be on vacation this next week and a half. Any needs arise, please contact Ruth in the church office or Pastor Roth. And I've been notified that Roth is not out fishing in Canada, so we're okay. All right? So, wonderful. Okay, so we'll turn it over to Pastor Phillips, and he will share with us, okay?
Well, good morning, everyone. Good morning. My name is Tom Phillips, and I'm a pastor for the deaf in Central Illinois, and I'm happy to be with you today. Today I'm going to share some things about my ministry. I'm not going to sign the whole time. The main reason is how many of you can speak two languages at the same time? I can't. The grammar in sign language and in English is different. And so sometimes my signs are downgraded, and sometimes my speech is downgraded when I'm trying to speak two languages at the same time. So anyway, well, today you'll see me say that again and again and again anyway. Okay. So I want to begin with a reading from, I'm not going to sign it all, I'm sorry. I want to begin with a reading from Romans chapter 10 and share a brief story about that, and then I'll get into talking more about the deaf ministry, okay? Romans chapter 10, verses 13 and following. For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. How then can they call on one they have not believed in? And how can they believe in one of whom they have not heard? And how can they hear without someone preaching to them? And how can they preach unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news. But not all the Israelites accepted the good news, for Isaiah says, Lord, who has believed our message? Consequently, faith comes from hearing the message, and the message is heard through the word of Christ. So far the reading. Well, for many, many years, many decades, many centuries, the Christian church struggled with the question, can the deaf be saved? Because of a verse just like this. Faith comes by hearing. Well, the deaf obviously cannot hear. And so what happens? How does a deaf person get to hear the message? And so the church struggled with that for many, many centuries. And it wasn't until, about 400 years ago, 500 years ago, some of those things changed. Now the story. In the late 1990s, my family was living in Iowa, southeastern Iowa, and our family was involved in foster care. During 5 years, we had approximately 25 different young people stay in our home. And they stayed with us for a time until they were able to move on to another situation. And one day, we had a call from the caseworker who said, I have a little girl who needs a place to stay. She's 8 months old. And when she came, she was like an 8-month-old newborn. She couldn't hold up her head. She had literally lived in her car seat, had infections under her chin. She hadn't had her diaper changed in maybe a day or two. And all of you who've had little ones know that a day or two is not nearly frequently enough. Well, this little girl came and she stayed with us initially, and we didn't really know. We knew we could love a child, and we certainly did. We loved on this little girl, and about 2 weeks after she came to live with us, we went to the 4th of July fireworks. And we were sitting on our blanket, and in our area there was a lake, and across the lake is where they launched the fireworks, and we were right up near the water and on the hillside with all the other families, and the fireworks were going off up in the air, and booms, and everything was taking off, and flashes of light, and my 3 boys, Josh and Micah and our youngest, Timothy, they were, some of them were shouting, and some of them were crying, and some of them were really into what was going on. And in my arms was this little child sound asleep. Didn't even know there were fireworks going on. She wasn't able to hear it. Yeah. And you've seen stories like that all around, haven't you? You've heard that kind of a story again and again. And it was a few months later that we began to notice that she also was not interacting with other people very well. No eye contact. Oftentimes would resist being held and things like that. And so we soon determined that she probably had some other needs. And it was confirmed sometime later that she indeed was on the autism spectrum. And so this little child, well, we took care of her, and after a year she was still with us. And after 18 months she was still with us. And then the state notified us that they were going to be terminating parental rights and that she would be up for adoption. And so the question that came to our minds and our hearts was, who is going to adopt a severely neglected, multiply handicapped child? Just out of the blue. No one searches for that sort of situation, Well, 6 months later, Mariah Joy was baptized into our family and into God's family. We celebrated. She was deaf, and that was the beginning of learning some sign language. I had already been serving in hearing parishes for 10 years, and so I kind of backed into deaf ministry. Most people in deaf ministry go to the seminary, take classes about sign language and deaf culture and things. I was out on the prairie of South Dakota and then in the southeastern Iowa, and then began to learn some sign language. Well, I was reading along, teaching Bible class on Sunday mornings, and I was teaching on Romans 6. Came across this passage here. Consequently, faith comes from hearing the message, and the message is heard through the word of Christ. And I was starting to wonder, who's going to teach my little girl about Jesus? Who's going to tell her about the love God has for her, that he gave up his son for her, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life? Who is going to be that person? And so we traveled 45 minutes once a month down to Burlington, Iowa. There was a pastor from, I think he was from the Quad Cities, Davenport, Iowa, and he would come down once a month to Burlington. And he would lead a service with about, 8 or 9 deaf adults. And these 8 or 9 deaf adults were all senior citizens. Okay? So we would travel down there, and because here's a pastor for the deaf, he's going to tell my little girl about Jesus. And so we were going, and we'd go once a month for about a 45-minute or an hour service. And after a while, I realized, that's just not enough. Right? I mean, going to church once a month, is that going to be enough to raise a child in Christ? Obviously not. We send our children to Sunday school, don't we? We bring them to the church services, and when they don't understand, we explain what the services are. When they're a little older, we might bring them to confirmation class with the pastor, but certainly we're teaching our children about Jesus. And it occurred to me when I asked that question, who's going to teach my little girl about Jesus? The answer is the same as it is for you. You teach your children about Jesus. I teach my children about Christ. And so that's began our journey in learning sign language, realizing that we were the ones who would bring the gospel to our little girl, Mariah. Her name was Mariah, M-A-R-I-A-H, after the singer. Okay, Mariah Carey, right? When we adopted her, we changed her name to Moriah, Mount Moriah. For on the mountain of the Lord, it'll be provided. That was our whole idea behind that name. It certainly was. 11 years ago, she died in her sleep. 13 years old. That was rough. But she knew who Christ was. She was a baptized child of God. She lives with him. And the first words that she heard with her ears, "Arise, my child." That's a lot of motivation to get into sign language, isn't it? That's a good reason to get into deaf ministry. The lesson here that I read, verse 14 says, how can they call on someone they've not believed in? And how can they believe in someone of whom they've not heard? And how can they hear unless someone is preaching to them? Well, what language was the Bible written in? That's a trick question, right? What languages was the Bible written in? Greek, Hebrew, Aramaic, right? Right? What language did Jesus probably speak among the people of his day? Aramaic, right? Yeah, you know these things. Well, what language do we speak? English, right? North Dakotan?
You betcha.
Well, I grew up in southeastern Michigan, so, we have the Midwest dialect, I suppose. And we call soda pop. Not sure what is it called up here, Coke? All righty. Yeah, so the language matters, right? It's not what dialect we're speaking, what language we're speaking. It's what is the message. And we have had the message given to us in English. What sends a deaf person to hell? Well, we know it's their sin, right? What can prevent that? The gospel, right? The gift. The gift of Christ. The forgiveness that comes only through him. The grace of God. The gift of the Spirit that gives faith to that person. What prevents a deaf person from knowing the message? Having it in their own language, right? It says, how can they preach unless they are sent? And how can they believe unless someone preaches to them? And so the point is the reason a deaf person does not know the gospel is when there's a lack of a preacher. There's a lack of someone bringing the gospel in their own language. Haven't we been doing this? Haven't we been doing this as a church for 2,000 years, right? 2,000 years we've been up to this, going to various places. When Paul traveled around in his missionary journeys, he traveled through Turkey, right? He traveled through Asia Minor, that area there. He traveled through those, speaking Greek in many places. He visited the Jewish synagogues. He spoke Hebrew in those places, Aramaic in those places. He visited the various places. When he was in Rome, I'm assuming he still spoke Greek, but, he visited various places, and he spoke in languages people could understand. And that is the whole idea behind deaf ministry. We want to bring the gospel to the deaf in their own language. Not just having somebody summarize what is said. When Pastor's going to be preaching soon, in an hour or so, he'll be preaching. I'll be signing. I won't be summarizing what he says. I won't be, listening to what he says and then fixing it.
I need to, right, Wayne?
Well, that's a temptation, isn't it? One time I attended a Lutheran funeral, and the pastor said, Jerry was baptized into Jesus on August 17, 1942. And the interpreter signed, Jerry accepted Jesus into his heart on August 17, 1942, when he was 3 weeks old. Yeah. Right. I mean, you see, and when an interpreter is tempted to sign from their own understanding, from what they know, their theology. Every interpreter has their theology, where they were raised, where they attend church. And if they don't attend church, then what kind of theology might they have then? They might just be using the generally accepted signs. But our sign language itself has theology behind it. For example, the sign for faith in some churches is think, faith. Think, believe. But in our Lutheran church, for faith, we don't sign think, faith. We sign faith. It's from God. It's a gift from God. We don't baptize or believe. We baptize or baptize. Water sprinkled or poured. Right? And so our signs show what we believe. And so that's why one of the things that I've done for many years is led workshops training church interpreters, Lutheran theology and Lutheran signing. It doesn't mean that all sign language is suspect, but it's important, especially as a pastor, to know if you've got someone who is interpreting for you, you want to make sure they understand what you understand, what they believe, what you believe, so that what is said is actually what you are saying. So no, I won't fix your sermon today. I'm sure. Well, on the other side, do we have any deaf people here today? Did anybody invite a deaf person to church today? That would have been really cool. Do you know 50,000 people in this city, right? According to a Minnesota survey, or some kind of a study, I don't remember which one it was, about 1 to 2% of the general population uses visual communication because of lack of hearing or hard of hearing. You'll hear me today. I will say deaf, and I mean both hard of hearing and deaf. That's just custom. It's my habit. So in a city of Minot size, 50,000 people, 500 to 1,000 deaf people. Right? Does anyone know a deaf person? Okay, a person who uses sign language. Yeah? Okay. Okay. Most states have what they call the sign for it is the institutions, but they're the deaf schools, the state schools for the deaf, Devil's Lake for North Dakota, right? Jacksonville, Illinois, where I live. Austin, Texas, St. Augustine, Florida. I can't think of, I know a whole bunch, I can't think of them all. Topeka, Kansas. A lot of times, these schools are set up on the edges of cities and they've grown around. And most of these schools are set up with a manual labor kind of a thing, so they might be a farm schools where the deaf were trained in farming and printing and that sort of thing. And so these schools are scattered around the states, and it used to be 40, 50 years ago that if a child was deaf in Minot, they went over to Devil's Lake and they lived at the school for the deaf, and they came home probably 6, 8, 10, 12 times a year. Where do you think that child is going to learn how to make their bed? At the school. Where is a child going to learn table manners? At the school. Where is a child going to learn, all those things, the interaction with other people? Where are they going to actually get their language from? From the school, right? Because many families at that time were not learning sign language. You have no idea how many deaf adults I have met whose family does not know sign language. They have been raised their whole life without sign language, or without communication with their families. And so the school becomes their family, and that's the way it was. And so oftentimes when a child would graduate from the school for the deaf, they stayed in that area. They didn't go back home as often. They stayed where the school was, and those schools became centers for deaf culture. And so when we look around the nation, you can see Rochester, New York, Washington, D.C. has the first in the world liberal arts college for the deaf, Gallaudet University. The American School for the Deaf up in Connecticut, that was the first school for the deaf in North America. And then in the early 1800s and mid-1800s, all the other schools were established. I'm not sure when Devil's Lake was set up, when that school was set up. I couldn't find that on their website. Anyway, those schools became the centers for the deaf culture. And in the 1896, let's back up a couple of years. In 1884, there was a Lutheran school for the deaf in Detroit, Michigan. And it was organized by a pastor who knew sign language. And somebody knew the pastor knew sign language and brought their 2 kids. And the pastor was teaching them reading, writing, arithmetic, and about Jesus. And the Lutheran School for the Deaf grew and became very popular. In the 1890s, 1892, there was a deaf man named Edward Paul who went to visit a church in Chicago. It was the largest church in the Missouri Synod at that time. Pastor was Augustus Reinke. And the deaf man comes to church and he writes the pastor if he could receive services in sign language. Pastor Reinke, the largest church in Synod at the time, starts learning sign language. 6 weeks later, leads the first service in sign language. I don't know if I could have done that, but that's pretty amazing. And the rest is history. After that, in 1896, 4 years later, Pastor Reinke went to the Synodical Convention, and the Synod adopted deaf ministry as its second mission. The first was India. The second synodical mission was deaf ministry. And then in 1901, Pastor Reinke was visiting Jacksonville, Illinois, which is, you think, the guy traveled from 5 or 6 different states in doing sign language for different churches, and he is the pastor of the largest church in Synod at the time. And so there had to be other pastors involved because he couldn't be going that much. But you get the idea that the ministry was starting to pick up steam, and in the mid-20th century, 1950s or so, Synod passed a number of resolutions that would establish deaf ministries in every district of Synod. And so, when you go to Jacksonville, Illinois, and you look across State Street, you'll see Christ Lutheran Church of the Deaf. If you're in Austin, Texas, and you look across the from the west gate of the school, Texas School for the Deaf, you'll see Jesus Lutheran Church of the Deaf. When you go to Wisconsin, and I keep forgetting the name of the town in Wisconsin. Anyway, when you're in Wisconsin, you got the School for the Deaf, and right across the road is the Lutheran Church of the Deaf. And so all across Synod, we set these up. Down in St. Augustine, Florida, right across the road, right from the gate of the school, you see the Lutheran Church of the Deaf. And so we set up missions all across Synod. At one point, in the 1990s, there were 65 pastors for the deaf in Synod. Okay? When I became a pastor for the deaf in 2001, so this is my 20th anniversary with deaf ministry and 30th as a pastor. When I started in deaf ministry in 2001, there were 47 pastors for the deaf. There were 18 vacancies, and that was the beginning of the general defunding of deaf ministry, because there are more ministries. There's Spanish ministry, campus ministries, there's the variety of ethnic ministries, people moving into the United States and setting up local ministries. In our area, we have a meat packing plant, and at the meat packing plant, there's a strong Hispanic population, Mexican Spanish, not Honduras or some of the other Latino countries. There's also a strong French-speaking African population that also is very much involved working at the packing plant. And so all these changes have divided the support that Synod has had for various ministries. And so today there are about 17 pastors for the deaf, and I am the only one who is fully supported by his district. All the others are raising funds, or they're part-time, or some other, the worker priests. And so this is the situation across Synod right now. And so we're seeing a lot of adaptation. We have pastors who do almost everything they do online. They do it live streaming, as we are today. They'll have podcasts, series of Bible studies they lead. The work that I do in Central Illinois is more traditional. To be fair with you, this is the first time I have ever live streamed anything. And so, how am I doing? I just keep going. That way I don't get nervous. So, we're more traditional. And so once a month I have a workshop where I gather the deaf from Central Illinois. They come to Jacksonville, and I'll teach a Bible class for 3 hours, and then we'll finish for lunch. We do retreats where we gather at our district camp, Camp Silka, Central Illinois Lutheran Camp. It's near Springfield, and we gather the deaf from 4 or 5 states that come in, and I lead a weekend retreat for the folks. And so, not so much live stream or podcasting, but more face-to-face, more relational. I have a hard time when I can't see the people I'm communicating with, because I get feedback from them, and it helps me be a better preacher and a better teacher. So, this is kind of a summary of where we're at. In Central Illinois, we have a district-wide parish. All of Central Illinois is Christ Lutheran Church of the Deaf in Central Illinois. I have preaching stations, Jacksonville and Bloomington. They're about 100 miles apart, and I don't preach at Bloomington every Sunday, but twice a month I drive up there. I have Bible studies in various communities. I also offer support to pastors who have deaf members in their congregations. I do mission festivals. I visit all the schools. Central Illinois has several Lutheran schools, elementary, high schools, two or three high schools. And so I visit all those, and I lead chapel and visit classrooms and those sorts of things. I lead workshops for interpreters to help them improve their interpreting in a church setting. So that's kind of a summary of what I do. For us, our congregation is fairly small. Our Jacksonville congregation meets every Sunday, and we have about 15 people on a Sunday. And we continue to meet. One of the blessings that has happened from COVID for us is we now receive the supper every Sunday. We receive Holy Communion every week because we don't know the next time we're going to meet. And so if like there was one day where I had been exposed to COVID, and so I had to miss, I was exposed like on a Saturday, so I had to miss 2 Sundays. And so in our area. And so what did they do? Well, as soon as we got back again, supper was there again. And so we continue to reach out that way. How many of the deaf people know who Christ is? That's one thing I haven't touched on yet. The best estimates we have is that about 2% of the deaf know Christ. 2% of the deaf population are Christians, or would say they have a relationship with a Christian church. And so if you start figuring those numbers out, compared to the hearing population, I don't know about North Dakota, but Illinois is down about 40% of the general population of Illinois are members of churches, are Christians. Less than half. Iowa was closer to about 50%, maybe even as high as 60%. And so if you think 2% of the deaf population, so in this room, how many people there would be one Christian in this room? Maybe 2, maybe 3. And so that would be, so when the deaf have a gathering, they come together, and what do they see? They see mostly non-Christians. That's so for a deaf gathering. And so our effort in Central Illinois is to gather the deaf together as often as we can. That's why I have face-to-face workshops and face-to-face retreats. We work with video phones, which is sort of like doing FaceTime with your phone. Except this is a dedicated device connected to the internet, and it's kind of like a Zoom meeting. I can bring up several people at the same time. It's not like Zoom in that I can't share my screen and things like that. So I have led services that way for a time, briefly. But, anyway, that kind of brings me to a point where if you have questions, feel free to ask. If you want to ask me a question, I'm open to answering. Yes, Pastor.
About 15 minutes, just kind of context.
Wow, I kept talking. Yeah, 15 minutes, okay. Right. You've got some question time.
The little phone you're talking about those crypto phones that print out. I mean, you say.
Oh, yeah, that's old school, right?
Yeah, it's old.
Yeah. Well, right. Back in World War II, they had these teletype machines so they could receive and send messages through a telephone line or through a hard line. And the deaf actually converted those in early 1950s. There were a lot of surplus from the war era. There was a lot of surplus, and those were actually converted to the TTY machines. That's what they're called. And the great big things, and boy, when they were receiving messages, they were ka-chunking and making all kinds of noise. You've heard of a manual typewriter. Well, think about a manual typewriter with a giant using it. But the deaf didn't care. They couldn't hear what was going on. But that was, and each deaf club had one. The towns had deaf clubs, and so each deaf club would have one, and so people would go there. One of the things that was different about the deaf culture is you couldn't just pick up the phone and call someone. You could do the typewriting, but what does typewriting require? A knowledge of English. Well, English is not the first language of the deaf. Many deaf people never get beyond 3rd, 4th grade reading level. Many actually get, doctorates and things like that. Very high level of academic excellence. But majority of the deaf are very low English reading level. They might be extremely skilled in sign language, but that's their first language. So the typewriter requires, the TTY requires a knowledge of English to communicate. Right. So does reading lips, by the way. Yes, ma'am.
Did you find some families that were very against having their children learn sign language and wanted them to learn to speak?
So, were some families against children learning to speak or learning sign language and instead learning to speak? Yes. In fact, that actually continues to this day. It has always been an issue where hearing parents of deaf children do everything they can that their deaf children may look hearing. Okay, and a book that I read some time ago was called Deaf Like Me. Deaf Like Me, and I've forgotten the man's name. Jim Spradlin, I believe. Deaf Like Me. And it's about this little girl who's deaf. Born, her mom is exposed to German measles during pregnancy, and the child is born deaf, and for several years the parents want her to be hearing, and so they send her to what's called an oral school, a school that is only no sign language. They sit on their hands, that kind of a thing, and they have to learn to speak. Well, in the first 2 years she was there, she learned 6 words. Okay, how many school teachers do we have here? Okay, can you imagine if your students learn 6 words over the course of 2 years?
In some cases, that's good.
Don't go there, school. I have 2 brothers and 3 nieces who are public school teachers. And so, obviously you have to be moving faster than that. Communication is everything. If you can't communicate, how can you make your needs known? How can you acquire more knowledge? Knowledge is acquired through communication, reading or speaking or understanding communication. And so one day she went to visit a deaf club with her parents, and it was like the whole world opened before her. And then later in life, maybe as a teenager, they were in a train station, and there was a deaf boy who had never learned sign language at all. And he was just unruly, unable to understand what was going on. His parents were clearly frustrated, and she looks to her dad and says, "Is he deaf like me?" Because he couldn't communicate. Something was very wrong there. So communication is everything. Yes, ma'am.
When you do your retreats and things, do you speak while you sign so they can have the visualization watching your lips, or do they just care about the signing and they don't enjoy it?
Yeah, so you're asking if when I'm doing my workshops and retreats, do I do simultaneous communication? Do I speak and do sign language? Depends on the population. Depends who's there. In our deaf church, we have probably about half to 2/3 of the folks at the church are deaf and use sign language. We also have hearing people. My wife and my son Micah are there in church all the time, and hi Micah, and so I speak for them. So I do depend, but it then depends on the population who is present. If I have a Bible study that I lead over in Quincy occasionally, in Quincy, Illinois, and over there the main person that is in attendance is hard of hearing and is able to speak quite well. So I do both. I speak and sign for him. And I even do a little what's called code switching. There's American Sign Language, and then there's Signed Exact English. And then there's stuff in between. Signed Exact English is every English word has a sign. Whereas American Sign Language it's a language unto itself. The Signed Exact English is English on my hands. And I'm not comfortable doing that, but I will shift into that if that's what my audience is. It's sort of like, okay, I've got a Spanish-speaking audience, I'll shift into Spanish. I'll speak Spanish for you. Or if this is a German congregation, I don't speak German, but I would shift into German if I knew German. See, it's
Canadian.
well, actually, the folks up here in North Dakota probably would have a really close dialect. You Canadians.
Too many Norwegians up here.
I won't even make an attempt at that. But I have, before in my life, seen a dollar horse. I saw the world's largest dollar horse in Mora, Minnesota. So that's my experience with Scandinavian heritage. And I think it's kuchen is very good. I did like that. Whoever suggested that I get some kuchen at the fair. Thank you. Yes, sir.
If hymns or organ music is played during the service, can the deaf people feel the different tones? can they perceive any of that through the vibrations and pitches?
Yes. Two questions there. One is, do we have music in our service? And do the deaf appreciate the music? And years ago, in the 1970s, a local drive-in theater was closed. And you know those speakers that you could hang on your car window? Okay? Well, the pastor got a whole bunch of them, brought them to the church, and he put them on the backs of the pews with the speaker facing the pew. So the sound was going out into the back of the pew. So the pew vibrated. And what he found out was that the deaf did not like sitting in those pews. But the answer to your question about are they able to appreciate things like the rhythm of the music and stuff? Yes. Yes. I have photos I can do a slideshow at times when I do presentations of a deaf girl with her hands on a speaker of a stereo, while the deaf kids around her are doing sign language, copying my signs for the music. And you'll see during the service that I will follow the rhythm of the hymn, and I'll also follow the emotion of what is being said. Like your closing hymn today is a very joyous hymn, and you'll see that on my face and on my expressions as I sign it, and my signs will be bigger, and so there is deaf music, but it's not what we would necessarily call music. So there's rhythm and there's a beat, sort of like a cheerleading. You know how cheerleaders will have set rhythms for the cheerleading. You know, you could probably, without even knowing the words to the cheer, you could take this rhythm and put it over at this school and over at that school, because the rhythms are interchangeable a lot of times. And so it's the same with the deaf. They have set rhythms. Yes, sir.
How do you go about teaching someone, say like your daughter, that sign language, doesn't know the words like we do?
How do I go about teaching someone who doesn't know sign language? First of all, I'm not a sign language teacher.
But they don't know the words too, like, we're familiar with the words.
Yes, exactly. That's a challenge. When the illustration that I often use in answer to that question is, when we moved to Jacksonville, we had our television against the end wall of the living room, and we had our couch was kind of across the middle of the room, and then you had our front door, so it was kind of an entryway behind the couch. Well, if my 3 boys and my daughter were all sitting behind the couch and the TV was on, my 3 boys are still learning English, because they're still hearing it. Even though they're not seeing the screen, they're not hearing it. My daughter didn't even know the TV was on. So that's an important aspect. We learn English by hearing it. And they say that a child needs to hear a word maybe even 400 times before they even try to say the word. Right? And so for a deaf child, you think, okay, a deaf child needs to see a sign how many times before they'll start to copy the sign. And so for the deaf children, especially the ones that arrive at the school for the deaf without any sign language, we focus on connecting things they already know and recognize and giving a related sign. Some of them are obvious. We can hold this up and say, look. And we teach them, book. Or the signs that are easy, that, like table. I'm going to sit down at my table. I'm going to eat. I'm going to drink. I'm going to use my spoon to eat some soup. Various things like that. Some signs are really archaic signs that you just have to learn. Like some of our English words, you just have to learn how that was and weren't are actually the same word. Was and were are actually the same word. It just depends who you're talking about. Did that answer your question? Yeah, so knowledge of English helps a person read, but it doesn't necessarily help them learn to do sign language.
Wow.
Yes, sir.
I can't imagine what Helen Keller went through.
Exactly.
Blind and deaf.
Yes, Helen Keller, who was deaf and blind.
Yeah.
The learning and so remember the first sign, you've all seen the movie, right? Yeah. Remember the first sign she learns? water. You know, she gets splashed, she gets water splashed all over her water. You know, and yeah, that was starting. And she in her case, she actually could hear until she had scarlet fever, I believe was the illness that led to her death and blindness. And so if a child has learned to speak English before they lose their hearing, they will often do better in English skills. And also, they'll be more successful in cochlear implants. Have you seen those or heard of those? It actually replaces the ability in your cochlea. Your cochlea has about 20 to 30,000 receptors, and they put a wire in there that's got 22 receptors. Okay? So you can see how the difference in the ability to hear has changed pretty dramatically. But people who already have a knowledge of English can get a cochlear implant and be successful. Rush Limbaugh, right? He had lost his hearing over the course of about 6 weeks, but he already spoke very well. What did he do? He got 2 implants, and did he miss a beat? Hardly. I mean, his speech did not change. He was able to keep right on. And so that's an example, too, that is important for us to recognize. Yes, sir?
I was around a person who could lip read, and the conversation she picked up really well. I was amazed what's the connection.
Well, first, a couple of questions. If she was able to speak before she lost her hearing.
I'm not sure.
Okay. Another thing is if she went to an exclusively oral school where that's all they did for 18 years or however many years she was in school, then she would be more successful perhaps at that. But the thing to remember with speech reading is that 70% of your language is behind your lips.
What?
It's behind your lips. If I say, I just said bat, pat, and mat, and it all looked the same on the lips. But what was different is what was behind my lips, right? They can't see a guttural sound. They can't see, what is the tongue doing unless you're really exaggerating, which makes it very difficult for someone speech reading. We just speak normally with someone if they're reading. So 70% of spoken language is behind the lips, and so that's something to think on. We don't want to rely exclusively on it. Best thing you can do if you know deaf people. Pad and paper. Yep. Use it. Write in it, and share it. And deaf folks are very much accustomed to that.
So they get the wrong impression of the statement or the conversation?
Very easily, they can get the wrong impression if they're relying only on speech reading, and that's also assuming they know English. Because without English, speech reading doesn't do anything. Or without whatever language they're speech reading in.
So when it comes to sign language, and we'll speak, considering it is a different language, does sign language change per language barrier, I guess? Let's say, if you go to Europe or Mexico or something.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. There are different sign languages depending where you are. And the languages are changing. In English, years ago, this meant sweetheart or boyfriend, girlfriend. Then it became video games. Then it became text messaging. So, the language changes. It still meant video game, but that kind of changed,
So, I guess, I don't speak any other language, but, if I listen to, let's just say, a couple Mexicans speak Spanish, I can normally catch the gist of what they're talking about. Is sign language the same way after you know enough of it, I guess?
Context is everything. If I'm doing this, and we were just talking about video games, or if you, actually I would say send me a message. I wouldn't message me. That's how I'd say it. But context is everything, yes. And a lot of our English words are that way too. Context is everything. If you the very same English word, homophobes, words that sound the same but mean differently. Context tells you what it is. Yep. All righty. Well, shall we close with prayer then? Okay. Well, we're glad to have you over here today, and we'll bow our heads in prayer and ask the Lord's blessings on the service to come. We pray. Father in heaven, we thank you that you have gathered us together today. And we ask that you would go with us today during the service, and for the folks that have heard the service already, please continue to bless them with your word and make strong our hearts that we can continue to serve you and follow your name. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen.